The hall had not been this quiet since the night Caedric Ravenhart hanged the last lord who tried to poison him. Not with dramatic ceremony, but with the same flat patience a man uses to close a window against the cold. 47 nobles stood in formal lines, and not one of them breathed too loud. That was the kind of man he was. Not the kind who needed to raise his voice, the kind whose silence made other men confess sins they hadn't yet committed. Stay with this story, because the night a girl of 18 walked into that silence without flinching, that was the night the most feared duke in the kingdom met the only enemy he would never know how to fight. The wedding contract had been signed in autumn, when the harvest was thin and Selene Arden's uncle had debts the size of a minor estate. She had not been consulted. She had been measured for the dress, for the dowry documentation, for her general fitness as a political object, and then informed of the arrangement the way a merchant informs a crate of glassware that it is being shipped north. Her uncle, Lord Fen Arden, had delivered the news over supper with the careful cheerfulness of a man who understood that he was doing something monstrous, but had reasoned himself into believing it was practical. He'd called it an opportunity. He'd used the word stability twice. He had not once looked directly at her face. Selene had sat with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing. She had learned early that silence in the Arden household was the only form of protest available to her, and she had learned to make it carry weight. She did not cry until she was alone, and even then she allowed herself only what she privately called a working cry. The kind that clarified rather than collapsed, that stripped away the softness of wishful thinking and left behind a harder understanding of what was real. She was 18 years old. She had been sold. The transaction was complete. What remained was the question of how to survive it. That question occupied her for the 6 weeks between the signing and the ceremony. She knew the stories, of course. Everyone in the kingdom knew the stories about Duke Caedric Ravenhart of Blackthorn. He had taken his title at 19 after his father died under circumstances that were officially ruled a riding accident and unofficially discussed in the kind of whispers that stopped the moment anyone important entered the room. He had spent the decade since building a reputation so precisely calibrated to induce fear that it had taken on the quality of weather, something vast and impersonal, something that simply was. Lords paid their obligations to Blackthorn without being asked twice. Men who had crossed him tended to find their alliances dissolving, their debts called in, their names spoken in the wrong rooms at the wrong times. He had never needed to be overtly brutal because he understood something that most powerful men didn't, that the imagination, given enough silence and space, would conjure horrors far more effective than anything he could orchestrate directly. He was also 31 years old and had never married, which the court took as confirmation of everything they suspected about his fundamental inhumanity. Selene had read everything available to her. She had asked careful questions of the household servants, who were either loyal to her uncle or frightened enough to be useless. And she had spent a great deal of time in the evenings sitting with what she actually knew versus what she had been told. The gap between those two things had always interested her. It was where the real information lived. What she actually knew was this. Ravenhart controlled the northern third of the kingdom's most productive land. He had survived 11 years of concerted political effort to unseat him. He was considered a genius of financial strategy by his allies, who were few, and a savage by his enemies, who were many. He had once, according to a document she found in her uncle's study, written a 17-page refutation of a trade agreement that had caused 3 senior ministers to quietly retire. The refutation had been correct on every point. A stupid man did not write that kind of document. A purely cruel man did not bother. She filed these observations in the same place she filed everything she wasn't yet sure how to use. The ceremony was held on the first day of winter in the capital's oldest cathedral, which had been chosen, she understood, because of its symbolic weight rather than any sentiment on the groom's part. The nave was full. Every significant noble family had sent representation, partly out of obligation, and partly because the political implications of this marriage were significant enough that no one with ambitions could afford to miss the room. Selene walked the aisle alone. Her uncle had offered his arm, and she had declined with the kind of gracious firmness that left no room for argument and gave him just enough social cover that he didn't press it. She wore her mother's pearls. It was the only decision in the entire proceeding that had been entirely hers. She saw him before she reached the altar. He was standing with the stillness she would later come to recognize as one of his most characteristic qualities. Not the stillness of a man waiting patiently, but the stillness of a man who had decided some time ago that most movement was wasteful. He was tall, which she had expected from the descriptions. Dark-haired, which she had also expected. What she had not expected precisely was the quality of his attention. He was watching her approach with the same expression a man uses when he is reading something complicated. Not cold exactly, but completely absent of the performance that most powerful men put on in public. There was no display of ownership, no strategic warmth, no visible calculation. He was simply watching her, with total focus, as though she were a problem he was genuinely trying to understand. She met his eyes. She heard someone in the crowd behind her make a small, involuntary sound, the kind that escapes when a person witnesses something unexpected. She had been told, by servants, by her uncle's wife, by a visiting cousin who had once attended a court function at Blackthorn, that no one met Ravenhart's eyes directly, not because he demanded deference, but because there was something in his gaze that made people look away instinctively, the way you looked away from something that might be looking back. She didn't look away. She watched his jaw shift, the smallest possible movement, the kind you would miss if you weren't paying attention, and understood that she had surprised him. That, she decided, was useful. The rest of the ceremony she conducted with the steady, blank composure she had spent 6 weeks constructing. When the officiant asked the required questions, she answered them clearly. When the moment came for the exchange of formal acknowledgement, this kingdom did not traffic in the word love as a legal formality. She kept her voice level. Ravenhart said his half of it with the same quality she had already identified in him, precise, unornamented, meaning exactly what it said and nothing more. No vows about tenderness, no language about happiness. An acknowledgement of mutual obligation, stated in front of witnesses. It was, she thought, the most honest thing about the entire day. The reception was held in the capital's primary state hall, which had been arranged with the specific intention of displaying the Duke's status rather than celebrating anything. Long tables, strategic placement of house sigils, a careful architecture of who sat near whom that contained more political information than most diplomatic documents. Selene sat beside her husband for 4 hours and learned a great deal. She learned that he ate sparingly and with precise attention to what he selected, the way a man eats when he has at some point in his life learned not to trust what is put in front of him. She learned that he responded to the ceremonial conversation of neighboring guests with absolute correctness and zero warmth. Not rudeness, but a kind of functional precision that made it clear he considered the performance a tax he was paying rather than an exchange he was interested in. She learned that he held a glass without drinking from it for extended periods, and that his eyes moved through a room in a pattern that was not social but tactical, sweeping the crowd in segments the way a soldier inventories terrain. She also learned, because she was watching carefully, that twice in 4 hours his attention landed briefly on the same man, Lord Crestwell, seated 3 tables away, a plump and pleasant-looking man who laughed frequently and seemed to know everyone, and that when it did, something in Ravenhart's face went very briefly and completely flat, the way a landscape goes flat before significant weather. She filed that away. She did not try to make conversation with him for most of the reception. She understood enough about his psychology, or thought she did, to recognize that an immediate overture would read as either desperation or calculation, neither of which would serve her. Instead, she managed her own social obligations with the practiced graciousness she had been trained to produce from childhood, thanking the right people, deflecting the intrusive questions about the marriage with gentle misdirection, making herself legible enough to the room that no one felt socially obligated to probe further. At one point, the wife of a northern minister leaned close to her and murmured, with the specific sympathy of someone delivering condolences at a funeral, that she must be very brave. Selene smiled at her. "I find bravery is mostly a question of having looked at something long enough," she said pleasantly, and turned back to her wine. It was near the end of the 4th hour, when the formal portion of the reception was dissolving into the kind of loose strategic socializing that would occupy the court until midnight, that Ravenhart spoke to her directly for the first time since the ceremony. "You've been watching Crestwell." She had not expected him to be watching her watch him. She recalibrated. "So have you," she said. The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long, It was, she would later think, the most significant 3 seconds of the evening. "Go to the East Corridor in 1 hour," he said. "A woman named Mira will find you. She manages the household. She'll have everything you need for tonight." It was not a question. It was not phrased with cruelty. It was simply the way he moved through the world. Information delivered, logistics covered, the expectation that she would do what made sense. He stood before she could respond, and by the time she had drawn breath to say something, she hadn't decided what, he had already moved back into the room. She stayed seated for a moment. "Brave," the minister's wife had said. Selene thought brave was probably not the right word. What she had was something closer to a fundamental refusal to be made smaller by someone else's comfort. It had gotten her in trouble her entire life. She suspected it was going to continue doing so. She went to the East Corridor in 1 hour. Mira was exactly what a person needed a household manager to be: efficient, plainly intelligent, and possessed of the specific quality of giving information without editorializing it. She was perhaps 50, with gray-threaded hair and the hands of a woman who had worked since childhood, and she walked Selene through the north wing of the Ravenhart Capitol residence with the brisk competence of someone who had been doing this for a long time and had no particular feelings about it either way. "The Duke has morning meetings that begin early," Mira said, moving down a corridor that was lit by evenly spaced candles rather than the more decorative arrangements in the public rooms. "You'll rarely see him before mid-morning unless there's a formal obligation. Your rooms are here." She opened a door onto a suite that was large and entirely impersonal. Good furniture, no objects, the absolute absence of any decorative choice that might reveal anything about the person who had selected it. The previous occupant was his secretary, who retired 3 years ago. "The Duke doesn't use these rooms." "That's very thorough," Selene said, stepping inside. "He asked me to make sure you understood the living arrangements before you assumed anything." Did he think I would assume something? Mira's expression did not change. "I do what I'm asked, my lady. There's a household directory on the desk. The kitchen closes to requests at 9 in the evening. If you need anything not covered in the directory, find me." She was gone before Selene had finished processing the sentence. Selene stood in the middle of the empty room and looked at the directory on the desk and the 2 candles that had been left burning and the bed that was practical and cold and made with military precision. She sat on the edge of it. The directory was exactly what it claimed to be: a comprehensive document listing every member of the household staff, their specific responsibilities, and the protocols for every domestic situation Selene might conceivably encounter. It was 16 pages long. It had been written by someone with the same quality of mind she had already identified in Ravenhart. Not warm, but genuinely precise. The work of a person who believed that clarity was a form of respect. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat in the quiet and let herself feel, very briefly, the full weight of the day. She was in a strange house. She had married a man she didn't know. Her uncle, who was the closest thing she had to family, had sold her as a political instrument and called it stability. She was 18 years old, and there was no version of this she could go back from. She sat with all of that for exactly as long as she needed to, and then she put it in the same place she put everything she needed to survive rather than feel, and she got up and changed out of the wedding dress and washed her face and went to bed. She was almost asleep when she heard it, the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, deliberate and unhurried, passing her door without pausing. A door further down the wing opened and closed. He was still awake then. She noted it and let it settle into the larger accumulation of data she was building about what kind of man he was. She slept. The first week in the Capitol residence established the texture of what her life was going to be. She saw Ravenhart at breakfast twice, at one formal dinner, and once in the library when she entered to find him already there, standing at the far table with a stack of documents that he did not put away when she entered. He acknowledged her with a brief nod and returned to what he was reading. She found a book and sat in one of the chairs near the window and read it. They existed in the same room for 2 hours in almost complete silence, and when he left, he said, without looking up from gathering his papers, "The second shelf on the eastern wall. The histories. They're worth your time." She looked at the shelf after he left. The histories were in fact excellent. She spent the rest of the afternoon with them. And the fact that he had noticed what she was reading and formed an opinion about it bothered her in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't threatening. It was something stranger than that. It was the sensation of being seen by something that wasn't supposed to be looking. She was navigating a real marriage to a man she didn't understand, inside a court that was watching both of them with the specific appetite of people waiting for something to go wrong. She understood this. She had understood it since the first reception, when she'd caught the particular quality of attention that certain nobles aimed at Ravenhart, not the open wariness of people afraid of him, but the specific focused patience of people waiting for a moment. She began attending the small social gatherings of the court's middle tier, the wives of ministers, the daughters of allied houses, the category of women who were considered politically adjacent rather than politically significant. It was the most information-rich environment available to her. Women in that bracket talked, because talking was one of the primary tools they had. Selene listened with the patience of someone who understood that information was the only resource she currently had in surplus. What she heard was consistent enough to form a picture. There were 4 houses most actively aligned against Ravenhart: Crestwell, which she had already flagged; the Vane family, whose patriarch had lost significant territory in a trade judgment Ravenhart had influenced 3 years prior; House Marath, whose connections to the Eastern shipping guilds Ravenhart had publicly documented as corrupt; and a more diffuse network centered around Lord Pell, who served on the King's Advisory Council and had, according to multiple sources, been attempting to consolidate enough noble support to petition for a review of Blackthorn's land holdings. She brought none of this to Ravenhart, not yet. She understood enough about how he moved to know that arriving with information before she understood what he already knew would read as either amateur or manipulative, and she was not willing to be categorized as either. Instead, she continued to build her picture and to find the edges of the household, and to figure out slowly what kind of man she had married. The answer to that question arrived on the 11th day at 6 in the morning in the form of a sound she had never heard before. She had been sleeping lightly, a habit she'd developed in her uncle's house where mornings could arrive with the sudden pressure of other people's moods. And she came awake at the sound without being able to immediately identify it. It was coming from somewhere in the wing. Not a crash. Not a voice. Something lower and harder to locate, with the quality of something sustained rather than sudden. She wrapped herself in a robe and opened her door. The corridor was empty. The sound was clearer now, coming from the room she had identified as Ravenhart's study, 3 doors down, and it took her another moment of standing in the quiet hallway to understand what she was hearing. It was a man working through something, not in distress precisely, but with an intensity that had the physical quality of effort. The sound of someone pacing and paper being moved, and the specific silence between movements that meant thinking so concentrated it had weight. And underneath all of it, every several minutes, a sound that was harder to categorize, not quite a voice. The exhale of a man pressing against something that was pressing back. She stood in the corridor for a long time. She should go back to bed. She knew that. The directional logic of her survival in this house was clear. Gather information slowly, do not intrude, do not become a complication before she understood the territory. She had 6 weeks of carefully constructed caution behind her, and all of it said the same thing. Wait. Understand first. Move second. She knocked on the study door. The silence that followed was total and immediate, the way sound stops when an animal senses something it wasn't expecting. Then, who is it? Not a question. A demand with the grammar of a question. Your wife, she said. The pause that followed this was different from the previous silence, less tactical, more genuinely disoriented, the pause of a man who had calculated for a large number of contingencies and had not included this one. It's 6 in the morning. I'm aware, she said. I heard you from down the hall. I wanted to make sure nothing was wrong. Another pause. Nothing is wrong. All right. She didn't move. Then I'll leave you to it. She was 2 steps back toward her room when the door opened. He was dressed, which surprised her. Not in anything formal, but in the dark working clothes of someone who had been awake long enough that dressing had seemed more practical than not. He looked, she thought, exactly like a man who had been fighting with something in his own head for several hours and had arrived at a state beyond tired into something more functional and more dangerous. His eyes, in the low corridor light, were very direct, What did you actually hear? He said. Someone working very hard on a problem, she said, and losing ground on it. His jaw shifted. The same movement she had seen at the altar, that smallest possible tell. You inferred that from a sound. I inferred it from several sounds over the course of about 10 minutes. Do you want to tell me what the problem is, or would you prefer I continue pretending I don't notice things? The look he gave her was long and entirely unreadable, the kind of look that made most people retreat or qualify. She stood her ground and waited. Come in then, he said. It was not warm. It was not an invitation exactly. It was the sound of a man making a decision he was not certain about and moving forward with it anyway because the alternative, whatever the alternative was, seemed worse. She went in. The study was large and completely functional. Bookshelves full of working documents rather than decorative volumes, a desk with 3 distinct work surfaces currently covered in papers and correspondence, a fireplace that had burned down to coals and was throwing off just enough light to work by. The mess was not the mess of a disorganized mind. It was the mess of a mind working across multiple problems simultaneously, and she could see the organizing logic of it even from the door. 3 separate areas of concern. Different document types. Cross-referencing. She looked at it and then looked at him. Sit, he said, moving back to the desk. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He sat himself, pulling a document back toward him. You're here. Sit. She sat in the chair across from the desk, not immediately across, which would have been directly confrontational, but angled slightly, which gave her the desk surface without demanding his attention. He noticed it. She saw him notice it. The problem, he said, without preamble, is that someone in this house has been moving information, not a servant. The pattern is wrong for a servant. Someone with enough standing to be present at the right events, and enough intelligence to take only what isn't obviously worth taking. How long? 18 months at minimum, possibly longer. He picked up a document and set it back down. The damage isn't catastrophic yet, but it's useful damage, consistent, targeted at specific financial relationships. Crestwell, she said. The silence that followed was one of the most charged she had experienced in the 11 days she had been in this house. He turned and looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, more like the controlled recalibration of someone who had expected to be managing a liability and was in the process of reconsidering the category. Why Crestwell? He said. Because you've looked at him twice in formal settings, with the specific expression you use when you're looking at something you've already decided is a problem but haven't yet moved on. Because he's well-positioned enough to be present at everything and pleasant enough that no one considers him a threat. Because he laughs too much for someone genuinely comfortable. She paused. And because when I was gathering information in the court last week, his name came up in 3 separate conversations in contexts that were each slightly wrong. Ravenhart was still looking at her. She could feel the weight of his assessment. Not hostile, but absolute. The kind of examination that didn't leave much untouched. You've been gathering information, he said. Did you expect me not to? Most people in your position would be managing their social presentation. I am managing my social presentation, she said. I'm managing it in the direction of maximum information yield. They're not different things, if you do it right. He looked at her for a long time. She was getting better at reading him, not because he was becoming legible exactly, but because she was learning which absences of expression were significant and which were simply default. This particular quality of stillness, she thought, was a man genuinely recalculating something important. I have a list, he said finally. 7 names. People I've identified as either directly involved in the information movement or positioned to benefit from it. Is Crestwell on it? He wasn't. I had him flagged as a person of interest, but hadn't confirmed the connection. A pause. He is now. And the others? He looked at her for another long moment. Then he reached across the desk and pulled one of the document stacks toward her. She picked up the first page and read it. It was a financial summary, property transactions, titled names, dates, and the analytical precision of it was immediately apparent. She turned the page. The second sheet was a correspondence analysis, tracking patterns rather than content, and it was even better. The kind of work that demonstrated not just intelligence, but a very particular quality of patience. The willingness to spend months building a picture rather than forcing a conclusion. She set it down carefully. "This is very good work," she said. "It's not finished." "No, but the framework is correct," she paused. "The gap is on the receiving end. You've traced the movement, but not the destination. You know who's taking, but you don't know who's directing." "I know who's directing," he said. "I don't have anything that would survive scrutiny in a formal setting. And you need it to survive that scrutiny. If it doesn't survive scrutiny, I look like a paranoid lord attacking a respected peer, which is what they want me to look like." He leaned back in his chair. The first gesture she had seen from him that wasn't fully controlled, a body expressing something the face wasn't prepared to, and pressed his knuckles briefly against his mouth. "If there's a mistake, any mistake, they don't need to be right about the mistake. They need the mistake to exist. The review of the land holdings moves forward. The financial pressure begins. Within a year," he stopped. "Within a year, Blackthorn is gone," she said. "Within a year, I am manageable," he said. The way he said manageable was the clearest indication she had yet received of what the word meant to him. It was the way a person says a word that has a personal history attached to it, a history of threat or loss or something specific enough to have changed the shape of the thing. She held that for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" she said. His eyes moved back to her with that quality of total attention she was learning to expect. "You're going to regardless. Why did you agree to this marriage?" The question sat in the room. She had not planned to ask it tonight, or this directly, but they were sitting in a study at 6 in the morning with the firelight almost gone and a conspiracy laid out in documents between them, and it seemed, suddenly, like the kind of moment that allowed direct questions. He looked at her for a long time. "Your uncle came to me with a proposal," he said finally. "The terms were financially reasonable and politically useful. A northern alliance through your mother's family's historic connections. It made sense." "That's why you agreed to the contract," she said. "I asked why you agreed to the marriage." Another pause. Different from the previous ones. Less tactical, more something else, more inward. "Because I needed something in this house that wasn't calculating the best way to use me," he said. And then, as though the admission had surprised him as much as her, his jaw tightened and he looked back at the documents on the desk, and the door that had opened briefly closed again. She sat with what he had just said. There it was, she thought. Not monstrous. Worse, in a way, because a monster was clean, a monster was straightforward, a monster you could construct a response to. This was a man who had spent 11 years building a fortress so precise and impenetrable that it had become indistinguishable from him, and who had, in one unguarded sentence at 6 in the morning, given her the information she had not yet known she needed, that somewhere inside the architecture of control and coldness and absolute strategic intelligence was a person still capable of wanting something as undefended as company that wasn't calculating him. She was not naive enough to think that was a solved problem. She was not naive enough to think that wanting something and being able to accept it were the same, but it was the most important thing she knew about him, and she would need it before this was over. Then, "We should work together on this," she said. Steady, direct, not soft, not strategic, just clear. "I have access to social spaces you don't. I can move in them in ways that don't trigger the same responses your attention does. What I gathered last week was incomplete, but the framework was right. Let me build it properly." He was still looking at the desk. The firelight was almost gone. "You understand what you're proposing," he said. "If this goes badly—" "I understand what I'm proposing," she said. Another silence. Long. She waited in it. He nodded. Once. And then he picked up a document and placed it in front of her, and they spent the next 2 hours working through it together, the study going from almost dark to the gray pre-dawn light that made everything look like it was being assembled from scratch. And when Mira knocked on the study door at 8 to deliver the morning correspondence, she opened it to find the Duke and his new wife seated on opposite sides of the desk, a collection of documents spread between them, and the particular silence of two people who have been working seriously for a long time and have not yet decided what to do with what they've figured out. Mira set the correspondence down without comment and left, and Selene, reading through the last of the financial analysis, did not look up when she said quietly, "The name you haven't put on your list yet, the one at the center of it, you know who it is?" "I suspect," he said. "Who is it?" He was quiet for long enough that she did look up. The expression on his face when he finally said the name was the thing she would carry with her for the rest of that day, and the day after, and every day until the Winter Crown Gala, when the full shape of the conspiracy finally became visible. Because it was not anger, it was not the cold tactical flatness she had learned to read as his version of restraint. It was something that looked for just a moment like the face of a man who had believed at some point that he could trust someone and had been wrong in a way that had taken years to understand. Lord Fen Arden, he said, her uncle's name. The room seemed to shift around her. She felt the blood move out of her face the way it does when something lands too directly, when information bypasses the usual filters and arrives without cushioning in the center of you. Her uncle who had sold her uncle who had called it stability, who had moved information for 18 months, who had arranged a marriage that put his niece in the same house as the man he was trying to destroy, who had created a position inside Blackthorn's own household from which the final act of the conspiracy could be run. She had been placed here, not as a wife, as a final piece. She set down the document very carefully. "Tell me," she said, and her voice was level, and her hands were still, and somewhere beneath both of those things something that had been holding a very specific shape since childhood, the shape of a girl waiting to be claimed by someone who was supposed to keep her, finally broke apart into something harder and colder and far more useful. "Tell me everything you know." The name hung in the study like smoke after a fire, present, specific, impossible to ignore. Selene sat very still. Not the stillness of shock, though the shock was real. The stillness of a person whose body understood, before the mind finished processing, that movement right now would cost something she couldn't afford to spend. She had constructed herself around a certain understanding of her childhood, not a warm one, not an innocent one, but one that had assumed the cruelty she experienced was incidental rather than designed. Her uncle was a man who used people the way other men used furniture, instrumentally, without malice. That had been survivable. That she had survived. This was different. This meant she had not been overlooked. She had been aimed. "He placed you here," Ravenhart said. He was watching her with the quality of attention she had already cataloged as his most dangerous trait. Not intrusive, but absolute. He didn't look away from the thing he was looking at. "You understand what that means." "It means everything I was told about the marriage was constructed," she said. Her voice came out level. She was dimly aware of being impressed by her own voice. The debt, the financial necessity, the Northern Alliance, cover for a specific placement. "The Northern Alliance is real," he said. "Your mother's family does have historic connections that are useful to me. That was probably why he selected you specifically, a reason that would survive investigation if I ever looked into it." A pause. "He's careful." "He's been careful my entire life," she said. Something in how she said it made Ravenhart go quiet. Not the tactical quiet she had learned to read as calculation. Something else. A shift that was more like recognition than analysis. She didn't want recognition right now. She wanted information. "What does he expect me to do?" she said. "In his plan. What is my function?" Ravenhart picked up one of the documents and turned it toward her. It was a correspondence summary. No full letters, just pattern analysis. Dates, recipients, the shape of what had moved and when. "The information I've been losing isn't catastrophic individually. Individually, it's manageable, but the pattern over 18 months creates a picture of my financial relationships, my alliance structures, my obligations. Give that picture to Pell's faction on the King's Council, combined with the right testimony from someone inside this household, someone who could credibly claim to have witnessed mismanagement," she said. "Or worse, someone whose testimony would be very difficult to refute." She looked at the document. Then she set it down very carefully on the desk, the way you set down something fragile when you have stopped caring whether it breaks. "He sold me," she said. "He sold me, and he put me here as a weapon." Yes. She breathed in once, then out. The thing that had broken apart inside her a few minutes ago was still settling into its new shape, and she could feel it in her chest like a structural shift, like load-bearing weight redistributing after something collapses. "He underestimated me," she said. "He thought you'd be frightened of me," Ravenhart said. "Not with any particular pride, just as an assessment. Most people are. A frightened woman in this house, positioned near my correspondence, near my household staff, She doesn't need to understand the conspiracy to serve it. She just needs to be available to testify to whatever she's told she witnessed. He doesn't know me at all, she said, and realized as she said it that this was the truest thing she'd spoken in 11 days. Ravenhart looked at her for a moment. No, he said. He doesn't. They worked until the gray light outside the study windows went from dawn to morning, and by the time Selene returned to her room, she had a clear picture of the conspiracy's architecture and a very specific understanding of the position she occupied inside it. She changed. She washed her face. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. The face of a girl her uncle had measured like a crate of glassware, calculated, and shipped north. And then she went down to breakfast with her back straight and her expression composed and ate a full meal because whatever was coming would require her to be functional. That afternoon, she attended a tea gathering in the east wing of the court. She smiled at the right women. She listened with the patience of someone who understood that patience was infrastructure, and she started, with great precision, to pull at the threads. 3 weeks passed with the particular quality of time that accumulates slowly when you're doing dangerous work that looks like nothing. Selene moved through the court with the careful social surface she had been trained to produce since childhood, and underneath it, she was building something with the methodical attention of a person who knows the stakes of getting it wrong. She had access that Ravenhart didn't, not to power, but to the lateral social world that surrounded power, the wives and daughters, and social secretaries who existed in close proximity to political men and were accounted for so little that they talked freely in each other's presence. She collected what they said with the selectivity of someone who understood the difference between information and noise, and she brought it back to the study in the early mornings, and together they layered it against what he already knew. It was not easy. It was not comfortable. They argued 4 times in the first 2 weeks. Real arguments, the kind that had sharp edges, over methodology and risk assessment, and the specific question of how quickly they could move against Crestwell before the broader network noticed. The second argument lasted 40 minutes. She remembered it precisely. "You want to approach Marath," he said. Not a question, a statement that had the quality of a challenge. "He lost ground because of your trade judgment," she said. "He has reason to be angry with you, but the anger is at a specific grievance, not at you categorically. He's not committed to the Pell faction. He's adjacent to it because he had no better option. Give him a better option. He's been in communication with Crestwell for 2 years. Adjacent communication, social contact, not conspiracy." She turned to face him from across the desk, because she had learned that he processed information differently when she made him look at her. "Ravenhart, there's a difference between a man who has decided to destroy you and a man who hasn't decided anything yet because no one has offered him a reason to. I've offered him nothing because I don't trust him." "That's exactly what I'm describing," she said. "Your distrust is strategic. I understand why it exists. I'm telling you it's costing you something in this specific case." The silence that followed was the kind that felt like pressure. "If Marath is converted and the information reaches Crestwell before we're ready," he said, "the whole thing accelerates. They move against us before the evidence is complete." "Then we make the evidence complete before we convert Marath," she said. "That's the sequence. I'm not proposing we move without the evidence. I'm proposing we identify the sequence correctly." He looked at her for a long time. "You think in contingencies." "I grew up in a house where I had to," she said. He looked away, not the retreat of someone losing an argument, more the movement of someone absorbing something they're not going to address out loud. He picked up a document. "The Crestwell correspondence. Finish reading it. Then tell me what you think the timeline is." She sat down and read it. He had conceded the point. He hadn't said so. He didn't need to. The reassignment of her attention to the evidentiary work rather than the strategic argument was its own acknowledgement, and she had learned enough by now to receive it as such. That was the thing about Ravenhart that was hardest to hold in her head simultaneously with everything else she knew about him. He was genuinely capable of changing his mind. Not easily, not without cost, not without the full weight of his resistance being brought to bear first. But when the logic demanded it, he updated. She had never met a man with real power who did that. Most powerful men, in her experience, treated being wrong as an assault and responded to it accordingly. He treated it as data. She found in the mornings that she was no longer sitting in the angled chair across the desk. She was sitting directly across from him, and neither of them had remarked on it. The court turned on her in the fourth week. It was not dramatic. It was not a single event. It was the slow withdrawal of warmth that happens when a social environment decides someone is too close to something dangerous. The wives of ministers began remembering prior engagements. The invitations to the gathering teas came less frequently and then stopped entirely. A woman who had been consistently pleasant to Selene for the previous 3 weeks passed her in the corridor outside the main hall and did not meet her eyes, and Selene understood from the quality of the non-meeting that it was intentional rather than absent. She had been associated fully and formally with Ravenhart. In the court's social economy, this meant she had become as isolating as he was. Whatever currency of likability she had built in the first weeks had been consciously spent against her by people who understood that the Duke's wife could not be an asset to them. She told Ravenhart that evening. "I know," he said. He was at the desk. He didn't look up from the document he was reading. "You expected it. I expected it before the wedding. You could have told me." "You would have prepared for it," he said. "Your preparation would have been visible. The way it happened, your response was genuine. Genuine responses are more interesting to people who are watching." She looked at him. "You used my social isolation as a data collection tool," she said. "I noted that it would produce information, yes. That's—" She stopped. She was aware, with a clarity that was faintly humiliating, that she was not angry about the manipulation exactly. She was angry about not having seen it coming. Those were not the same thing. "You could have told me," she said again, with different weight. He looked up from the document. The expression on his face was the one she had identified as his version of acknowledgement. Not apology, nothing soft, but something that meant the message had been received and processed honestly. "Yes," he said. "I could have." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she sat down and picked up the correspondence file she had been working through and opened it to where she'd left off. She stayed angry for 2 days. She did not adjust her behavior around it because she understood the difference between feeling something and acting from it. On the third day she found, with the same surprise she always felt when it happened, that she had stopped being angry and started being curious about the specific shape of the decision he had made. Not because it was right, but because it told her something about the texture of his thinking that she hadn't had before. He had calculated her. He had used the calculation. And then he had said yes when she directly asked if he could have done differently, which was the kind of honesty that cost something, and he'd spent it anyway. She was building a picture still. It kept becoming more complicated. The servants were the next problem. Not all of them. Most of the Blackthorn household staff were what Mira had assembled, loyal in the specific way of people who had been treated with consistent respect and knew it was not universally available. But there were 2, identified over the course of the 4th and 5th weeks, who existed in a different category. A man named Doven, who served as steward to the Capitol Residence's correspondence room, and a woman named Hassel, a nickname. No one seemed to know her given name, who worked as a junior attendant to the Duke's formal wardrobe and had far more access to the formal receiving rooms than her stated position required. Selene identified Hassel first. It was a small thing, an inconsistency in where she was when she was supposed to be somewhere else, noted twice, combined with a quality of attention during one of the formal dinner evenings that was slightly wrong for a wardrobe attendant in a receiving room, not focused on the guests in the general way of someone doing their job, focused on specific guests specifically with the kind of intent that meant she was listening rather than managing. She brought it to Ravenhart without the full confirmation. "How certain," he said. "Not certain enough to act on. Certain enough to watch." "Watch, then." She watched. Doven she found through Ravenhart's correspondence analysis. A pattern in what reached the correspondence room versus what Ravenhart actually saw. A gap too small to be careless and too consistent to be coincidence. She confirmed it over 3 days of careful attention and brought it back with the documentation. Ravenhart looked at the analysis for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You know what we do with this," he said. "We don't remove them," she said. "Not yet. We use them." "Explain." "If they disappear, Crestwell knows we've identified the leak. He accelerates. If they stay, we can manage what moves through them, feed certain information, starve other information, control the picture he's building." She paused. "And we watch where the information goes. which confirms the link to Crestwell, or tells us there's a link we haven't identified yet. Ravenhart was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to argue. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated with the small satisfaction she had learned to allow herself. Not triumph, that was a different thing, and she was careful about the difference. Just the satisfaction of a thing done correctly. They were 3 days away from the Winter Crown Gala. She was not thinking about the gala. She was thinking about the Marath conversation, which they had finally agreed to initiate, and about the correspondence timeline, and about the sequence of evidence that needed to be in place before they could move openly against any of the 4 houses aligned against Ravenhart. She was not thinking about her uncle. She had not thought about him directly since the morning in the study, not because the knowledge of what he had done had faded, but because she had put it in the same place she put everything she needed to survive rather than feel, and she needed it to stay there until she could afford to take it out. She was in the library the evening before the gala, working through a set of trade documents that connected Marath to the Eastern Shipping Guild in ways that were more useful than damaging. The outline of an argument for why Marath's interests were better served by alliance than opposition, when she heard Ravenhart in the doorway. She did not look up. He came in when he had something to say. He stood in the frame when he was still deciding. She turned a page. "The King's Counsel," he said. She looked up. His face was the careful blank of someone managing a significant response. "Pell has requested a formal session, day after tomorrow. The stated subject is a review of Northern Land Administration practices." A pause. "The actual subject is me." She set down the document. "They've moved up the timeline," she said. "Yes. Because of the gala. They want to do it in front of the full court." She was already running the sequence in her head. Who would be in the room? What evidence was currently complete versus incomplete? How much the Marath conversion would matter if the council session happened before they could secure it? "How long do we have?" "The gala is tomorrow night. The session is the morning after." "That's not enough time to complete the Marath." "No," he said. She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides, and the quality of stillness she associated with him at his most genuinely controlled, not the absence of something, but the presence of something being held very tightly. "They know we've been building the case," she said. "Someone told them how close we are." "Yes." "Hassel or Dovin. One of them was more useful to Crestwell than I managed," he said, and the flatness in his voice when he said it told her this had cost him something he wasn't going to show her directly. She stood up. "Then we changed the approach," she said. "We can't complete the evidence package by the morning after tomorrow, so we don't try to. We use the gala." "Explain." "The gala is the whole court in one room. Every house that matters, every alliance, every person who has been sitting carefully neutral waiting to see which side survives. If we can move the right information to the right people during the gala, not the full evidence, but enough of it, in enough mouths, then when the council session happens the next morning, Pell doesn't have the room he needs. He has noise. He has competing narratives." She paused. "It's not clean. Clean is gone. This is damage control toward a better position." Ravenhart was quiet. "You'll be exposed at the gala," he said, "directly. If they understand what you're doing, they'll understand what I'm doing," she said. "That's the point. They need to understand that I am not the weapon my uncle built, that I am not available to testify to things I didn't witness, that I know exactly what was arranged and I know who arranged it." She looked at him steadily. "The moment they understand that, the arrangement collapses. I was the final piece. I have to be the piece that doesn't fit." The silence in the library was long and very specific. "If this goes wrong at the gala," he said, "there is no recovery. Pell moves the council session forward. The accusation shifts from land administration to treason. Your testimony becomes the kind that's extracted rather than offered." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the first morning in the study, with that quality of total attention that didn't leave much untouched, moving through her the way a serious mind moves through a problem it is genuinely trying to solve. Except it wasn't exactly that. It had shifted from that. She could feel the shift without being able to name it precisely. "You understand that if they take you at the gala," he said, and stopped. She waited. He looked away. Back. I will not be able to keep the council session from happening, he said. I will not be able to stop what follows from it. I know, she said. Selene. It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it land in her chest like a weight dropped from a height. Not painful, but definitive, the way a door sounds when it closes on something that had been open for a long time. I know what I'm proposing, she said, quietly and completely clearly. I know what it costs if it fails. I'm telling you it's the right move anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. And somewhere across the capital, in a townhouse that smelled of old money and careful deception, Selene's uncle Fen Arden was receiving a message that his niece had been seen with documents she should not have access to. And the expression that crossed his face when he read it was not the expression of a man surprised. It was the expression of a man who had anticipated an obstacle and had already prepared for it. The gala began the way all significant events began in the capital, with the performance of normalcy stretched so thin over the actual tension that it was essentially transparent to anyone paying attention. Selene paid attention. The great hall of the royal palace had been dressed for winter ceremony with the specific extravagance of a court that understood spectacle as a form of argument. Every candle, every arranged flower, every strategic placement of house banners making a claim about the natural order of things. 300 people in formal dress, moving through a space designed to make them feel simultaneously significant and accountable to something larger than themselves. She had been to enough of these to read the room the way you read a document, not for what was displayed, but for what the display was covering. She saw Crestwell within the first 10 minutes. He was doing what he always did, which was laugh at things slightly too readily and position himself at the productive center of multiple conversations simultaneously. He had not yet seen her, or if he had, he was managing the fact of her presence with the same pleasant surface he managed everything with. She saw Lord Pell near the king's dais, a narrow man with the patient eyes of someone who had spent decades learning that the right moment, waited for long enough, would always arrive. He was speaking with 2 council members whose names she knew from the correspondence files. Whatever they were discussing it with the careful brevity of people who had already said the important things elsewhere. She did not see her uncle. That registered. She moved it to the active part of her attention and kept moving. Ravenhart was at her side, but not close, not hovering, but present with the specific quality of a man who had decided to be somewhere and meant it. He had said very little since they left the residence. She had said very little back. They had agreed on the broad shape of the evening, and both understood that the specific execution would depend on what the room gave them, and that discussing it further was the kind of activity that consumed energy needed elsewhere. She began working. The first conversation was with a woman named Lady Ashcroft, whose husband sat on a minor trade committee, and who had been pointedly cooler to Selene over the past 3 weeks than she had been in the first. Selene approached her with the warmth of someone who had not noticed the cooling, which was its own message, and within 4 minutes had moved the conversation to the Eastern Shipping Guild irregularities in a way that felt like gossip and was actually an information deposit. Lady Ashcroft would repeat it. That was what Lady Ashcroft did. Selene had selected her for exactly that reason. The second conversation was harder. A cluster of younger lords near the eastern wall, the kind of men who had inherited enough to be comfortable and not enough to be genuinely powerful, and who consequently spent a great deal of energy performing sophistication. She inserted herself with a question about the upcoming harvest assessments and steered, carefully, toward the question of Northern land administration, specifically toward the documented efficiency of Blackthorn's management practices, which she had spent 3 evenings memorizing in their most compelling form. Not defense of her husband, neutral enthusiasm for good governance, which was a subject these men could engage with safely without committing to anything. She planted what she could plant and moved on. 40 minutes into the gala, she still had not seen her uncle. She found Ravenhart near the West Gallery. He was speaking with a general whose name she recognized from the alliance documents. One of the few military relationships he maintained that was genuinely reciprocal rather than transactional. She stood beside him for a moment and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the general looked between them with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "Fen Arden isn't here," she said quietly, when the general had moved on. "I know," Ravenhart said. "He was on the invitation list." "Yes." She looked at the room. 300 people, every significant house, the king at his dais receiving a stream of formal presentations. Pell in his position near the council members, Crestwell laughing at something across the hall. "He sent a proxy," she said. Not a question. "I don't know yet." A pause. "Keep moving. Don't change the pattern." She kept moving. The next 40 minutes were the most precise work she had done since arriving in the capital. She moved through the room's social geometry with the systematic attention of someone dismantling something carefully, not destroying it, just separating the components, leaving each conversation with something planted that would grow in the hours and days that followed. She was good at it. She had been trained for rooms like this since childhood, and whatever her uncle had intended that training for, it was serving her now, and she felt, beneath the tension of the evening, the particular cold satisfaction of a skill being used correctly. She was in the middle of her 8th conversation, a cluster near the main staircase. 4 women from northern allied houses whose husbands were currently neutral and whose opinion of Ravenhart was being actively managed by both sides. When she felt the room change, it was not a sound, it was a quality of attention. The way 300 people in a room shift their orientation simultaneously towards something without any of them quite deciding to. She felt it before she identified the source, and then she turned and saw what had changed. 2 of the king's household guard had entered from the eastern corridor. Behind them, Lord Pell. Behind Pell, 2 men she recognized from the council documentation, Marath, which surprised her, and a name she hadn't flagged as significant. And behind all of them, moving with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had prepared for this evening very differently than she had, her uncle. Fen Arden looked, as he always looked, like a man who had just come from a pleasant lunch. Pink-faced, well-dressed, the expression of someone who found the world fundamentally agreeable because he had arranged it to be. He was scanning the room with the specific patience of someone who knows what they're looking for and is certain they'll find it. His eyes found Selene. Something passed across his face that was not quite a smile, more like a confirmation. She understood in that moment that she had been wrong about one critical thing. She had understood that she was the piece that wasn't supposed to fit. She had understood that her refusal to testify as arranged, her active work against the conspiracy, was the move that collapsed the plan. What she had not understood, what she saw now, reading her uncle's face across a crowded room with the clarity that comes when you finally have all the information you needed 3 weeks ago, was that he had anticipated this. He had anticipated her. He had a backup. She was moving toward Ravenhart before she had consciously decided to move, cutting across the room's social geography with a directness that was going to be noticed and noticed incorrectly, but there was no version of the next 3 minutes where she wasn't noticed. She reached him near the north wall. He saw her face and his attention sharpened immediately. "My uncle is here," she said, "with Pell. He has something else, something we haven't—" "I see him," Ravenhart said. "He prepared for us knowing. He's been prepared for it. Whatever he's brought tonight, it isn't the original plan." Ravenhart's eyes moved across the room in the tactical sweep she had watched him do 100 times, reading the positions, reading the alignments. She watched him land on Marath and go very still. "Marath," she said. "Marath came with Pell," he said. His voice was completely controlled, which meant he was managing something significant. He was supposed to be neutral. "He was never neutral," she said. "We were wrong about that." The acknowledgement landed between them without softness. They had been wrong. The Marath conversion had been a target, not an accomplished fact, and in the space where they had planned to build an alliance, there was instead another piece of the opposition. "How much does he have on Marath?" she said. "Enough to make the council session tomorrow into something unrecoverable," Ravenhart said. And then, with the flatness she had learned to read as his version of something that cost him. "Marath's shipping interests. I have documentation of irregularities in the Eastern Guild. I hadn't moved on because I was holding it as leverage. If your uncle has the same documentation and has used it as coercion rather than leverage, then Marath isn't allied with Pell," she said. "He's owned by my uncle." "Yes," she breathed. The room was continuing its gala performance around them. Music, movement, the liquid social noise of 300 people performing the version of themselves they considered most advantageous. None of it had adjusted to what was coming. She was aware, with the particular hyper-clarity she got under real pressure, of exactly how much of this room's reality was about to change. "They're going to move tonight," she said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Yes, Ravenhart said. He had already arrived at the same conclusion. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his hands had moved to a very specific stillness at his sides. Not calm, but the opposite of calm, the tightly organized opposite of it. He was looking at the king's dais. If they do it here, she said, following his line of sight, in front of the full court, before there's any opportunity to respond, it becomes the record, he said. Whatever is said tonight in front of these witnesses becomes what happened. Evidence is secondary to testimony that's already in 300 mouths. She looked at her uncle. He was moving now, steadily, in the direction of Lord Pell and the 2 council members, and she could see the path he was cutting with the social precision of a man who had walked this exact route in his head many times. Marath fell into place near Pell with the mechanical coordination of something rehearsed. Selene, Ravenhart's voice quiet and direct. She looked at him. If you leave the room now, if you remove yourself before they can, then they use my absence as evidence, she said. They say I fled because I knew what would be said. She shook her head. There is no version of leaving this room that works. He looked at her. She looked back. The specific weight of this moment, the 2 of them standing at the edge of something they had tried to prevent and had not prevented, with 300 witnesses about to become the instrument of their destruction, had the quality of the last few seconds before a fall, when you know the ground is coming and the only remaining question is how you land. Then stay close to me, he said. She stayed close to him. It happened fast. That was the thing about prepared betrayal. It moved quickly, because every step had been walked before, and hesitation wasn't a risk because the people executing it had already decided. Pell moved to the space near the king's dais with the practiced ease of a council member exercising a procedural right. He spoke first to the king's household chamberlain, briefly, and whatever he said produced the response he had anticipated. A slight adjustment in the room, the music dimming, the chamberlain raising his voice to call the formal attention of the court. The room quieted. 300 people turned toward the dais. Pell stepped forward. By the authority of the King's Advisory Council, he said, in the particular voice of a man who had used that phrase many times and understood its effect, I bring before this court a matter of urgent security concern. Evidence has been received. Evidence sworn to by credible witnesses and supported by documentation, indicating that the Duke of Blackthorn has been engaged in a systematic effort to undermine the legitimate governance of this kingdom's northern territories through financial manipulation, suppression of opposition, and acts that constitute, under the Council's assessment, treason. Under the Council's, the word treason landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water, not loud, but with a spread that reached every edge. She felt Ravenhart go completely still beside her. The Council calls, as primary witness to the Duke's conduct, Pell continued, his wife, the Duchess of Blackthorn. A pause. Who will confirm before this court what she has witnessed during her residence at Blackthorn, and what she was instructed to do upon her placement there? Every pair of eyes in the room found her. She understood, in the absolute clarity of that moment, what her uncle had built. Not just the conspiracy, not just the information network, not just the coerced testimony of Marath. He had built a version of her, a version that could stand before this court and confirm whatever she was supposed to confirm, that existed in the minds of everyone in this room as a possibility, as a potential, as a woman who might have witnessed things and might testify to them and was, after all, only 18 years old and might simply be frightened enough to say what she was told. He had built her shadow, and he was going to make her stand in front of it. She stepped forward. She felt rather than heard Ravenhart's breath shift. Not a warning, not a restraint, something harder to name. The sound of a man who had understood that the person beside him was about to do something he couldn't stop and wasn't sure he should. She walked to the open space before the dais. 300 people watching. The king, in his formal chair, with the expression of a man who had been given insufficient information about this evening and was managing his reaction accordingly. Pell with his patient eyes. Marath looking at the floor. And at the edge of the gathered council group, her uncle, watching her approach with the expression of a man watching a piece he had placed on a board arrive where he had always intended it to be. She stopped in the center of the room and turned to face the court. I am the Duchess of Blackthorn, she said. Her voice was level and clear enough to reach the room's edges. And I am prepared to give testimony. Pell's expression remained composed. He had prepared for resistance. He had prepared, she understood, for several versions of this moment. Then we ask you to confirm before this court. I'll confirm what I know, she said, which is this. She turned slightly, not to Pell, but to the room, to the 300 people who were the point, who were always the point. I was placed in this marriage deliberately. My uncle, Lord Fen Arden, arranged the contract knowing that my position as the Duke's wife would give me access to his residence, his correspondence, and his household. He intended me to gather information and to testify to whatever he required me to testify to. The sound that moved through the room was not loud, but it was total. He made one mistake, she said. He arranged the marriage without speaking to me first. She looked at her uncle across the room. I know every name in the network, she said. I know the correspondence pattern. I know the information that was moved through Dovin and through the woman called Hassel. I know the Eastern Guild documentation that Marath signed and that you've been holding over him for 14 months. She watched his face change, the pleasant surface going through something it wasn't designed to manage, the specific change of a man who has planned for several contingencies and is discovering in real time that he has not planned for this one. I know who you report to on the council and what they were promised when Blackthorn fell. I know all of it, and I am prepared to give the King's Court every piece of it, under oath, with documentation, at whatever formal proceeding the King chooses to convene. The silence in the room was unlike any silence she had experienced. Pell started to speak. She didn't let him. You brought me here to testify, she said. I'm testifying. Then Ravenhart spoke. She had not heard him move. He was suddenly beside her, not behind her, and the quality of his presence in the room changed the moment he chose to use his voice. Not loud, but with the specific weight of a man who had spent 11 years making sure that when he spoke in rooms like this, he was listened to. Anyone who touches my wife, he said, is my enemy, from this moment, permanently. It was not complicated language. It was not a legal argument or a formal protestation. It was the bluntest possible declaration, said in front of the king and 300 witnesses, with the quality of a man who was not performing a threat, but stating an intention he had already fully committed to. The simplicity of it was its power. There was no conditional in it, no qualification, no political softening. The king was standing. In the specific grammar of this court, the king standing during an ongoing address was not a small thing. The room responded to it the way rooms respond to weather. A full-body collective adjustment, everyone reorienting simultaneously. Lord Pell, the king said, in the voice of a man who had been managing his surprise into something functional. Explain to me how a proceeding of this nature came before my court without my prior knowledge. Pell's composure held, but only just. Your Majesty, the council has standing procedure. You have standing procedure for a public accusation of treason at a state gala, the king said, without any particular inflection. In the silence that followed, Selene looked at her uncle. Fen Arden was looking back at her. The pleasant surface was gone now, not replaced by something ugly exactly, but stripped away to something colder and more accurate. The face of a man who had spent her entire life calculating and had arrived, at the end of a very long chain of calculations, at an outcome he had not predicted. She could see him processing it, running the sequence, understanding what she had just done to the timeline, to the network, to the careful architecture he had spent years constructing. He would not forgive her for this. She had known, in some part of herself that operated below language, that this was the point of no return, not just strategically, but personally, permanently, in every way that the word family had ever meant anything to her. The last thread of the thing she had called home, already frayed to near nothing, severing completely in front of 300 witnesses. She breathed in once. She breathed out. She stood in the center of the room and held what she had just become. No longer a piece in someone else's arrangement, no longer the girl who had been measured and shipped north without consultation, no longer the weapon that had been aimed and failed to fire. Something else entirely. Something that didn't have a name yet, but was real and was hers. Ravenhart's hand found the small of her back. Not possessive, not a claim, just contact. The pressure of a body acknowledging another body's presence. And she felt it land with the same weight as her name had landed, days ago in the study, in the same place in her chest where something had been hollow for a long time. Around her, the room was fracturing. She could hear it in the changed quality of the noise. 300 people no longer performing social coordination, but actively processing, realigning, running their own calculations about what the next 12 hours meant for their positions. Pell was speaking to the king with the controlled urgency of a man trying to manage a situation that had moved outside his management. Crestwell was no longer laughing, and in the space where her uncle had been standing, there was now only the careful absence of a man who had left the room as quietly as a man like that knows how to leave a room. He was gone. And somewhere in the exit he had just made, in the specific intelligence of a man who understood that the game had changed before she had finished her last sentence, she knew with absolute certainty that this was not over. It was worse than not over. He had been expecting her to stay silent. She had spoken. He had been expecting her to be the weapon. She had turned it around. And Fen Arden, who had spent his entire life calculating and who had been wrong tonight in ways that would cost him enormously, was not the kind of man who lost gracefully. He was the kind of man who came back. He came back 3 days later, not in person. Fen Arden was too careful for that. Too careful and, Selene understood now, too genuinely afraid, which was more dangerous than simple calculation, because fear in a calculating man produced decisions that were harder to predict. He came back through the only channel left to him after the gala, the formal complaint mechanism of the King's Council, which Pell, who had survived the evening's disaster through the specific political talent of never being the person whose name was attached to the worst moments, had filed on his behalf. The complaint accused Selene of perjury. It accused Ravenhart, in more careful language that nonetheless meant the same thing, of coercing his wife's testimony under duress. And it requested, in the measured procedural language of a document written by someone who had spent 40 years navigating exactly this kind of institution, that the Duchess of Blackthorn be separated from her husband's household pending a formal council inquiry into the accuracy of her statements at the gala. Separated. The word sat in the document with the specific weight of a word chosen because the word it meant was worse, detained, controlled, made available for the kind of testimony that was extracted rather than offered, in an environment where the Duke's presence was not a factor. Ravenhart read the document at the desk in the study. Selene sat across from him. He read it twice and then set it down with a precision that was not calmness, but the functional equivalent of it, the absolute management of a response he was not going to let direct him. Pell survived, she said. Pell always survives. It's his specific talent. He looked at the document. Crestwell didn't. After the gala, 3 of his primary financial relationships withdrew. He doesn't have the standing for another direct move. But Pell does. Pell has the council mechanism. Ravenhart stood and moved to the window. The capital outside was gray and cold, winter pressing down on everything. If this complaint proceeds to a formal hearing, the separation order becomes enforceable within 72 hours. The hearing is set for 4 days from now. 4 days, she said. We have 4 days to make the complaint unsustainable. He turned from the window. His face was controlled in the way she had stopped confusing for calm. Beneath it, she could read the specific quality of pressure she had come to know as him working against something that was genuinely threatening. The documentation we have isn't complete. It was never complete. The gala accelerated everything before we were ready, she said. I know. A silence. I need Marath, he said. She looked at him. Marath testified against you 3 days ago. Marath testified because your uncle owns his shipping documentation and made sure he understood what would happen if he didn't. Marath is not committed to Pell. He is owned by a specific threat. He moved back to the desk, and the quality of his attention sharpened into the thing she recognized as his version of fully committed, not energized exactly, but consolidated, all of it pointed in one direction. If I remove the threat, I remove the obligation. You'd have to find the documentation first, she said, the copies your uncle holds. Yes. In 4 days. Yes, she breathed. Where would he keep it? His townhouse, the Eastern District office he maintains for the Trade Committee work, possibly a third location I haven't confirmed. He looked at her directly. I need you to tell me which one. She held his gaze. She had not been to her uncle's townhouse in 4 years. She had not spoken to him since before the wedding, not substantively, not in any way that had involved actual information exchange rather than the performed pleasantness of a family relationship maintained for appearances. But she knew him. She had grown up in close proximity to the specific quality of his mind, methodical, cautious, always operating with redundancies. And she understood without needing to verify it that the most important documentation would not be kept where someone might look for it. His study, she said. Not the townhouse. The committee office is too exposed. His study is inside the townhouse's interior rooms. No external access, one entrance. Domestic staff who have been with him for over a decade and are loyal in the way staff becomes loyal to a man who controls what they know about themselves. She paused. Third drawer of the writing desk, left side. He keeps documents he wants immediately accessible but not obviously located in a false-bottomed section. He's used that configuration since I was 12. Ravenhart was watching her face with the quality of attention that had stopped being just analytical some time ago. Something more personal had moved into it, something she still didn't have precise language for, but which she felt as a specific kind of weight. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain about the configuration. The specific documents may have been moved." She held steady. "It's the best information I have." He nodded. Then, "I'm going tonight." "I know. You're not coming. I know that too." She met his eyes. "If you're arrested in my uncle's townhouse, the complaint proceeding becomes a murder trial. Don't get arrested." Something moved across his face. She had gotten better, over the weeks, at reading the things he allowed himself almost without meaning to. The small failures of the absolute control, the moments when something real moved through the careful architecture. This was one of them. It looked, she thought, like what gratitude looks like in a man who has almost no practice with it. "I'll be back before morning," he said. He was not back before morning. That's it. She stayed awake until 4. Then she lay down on the study's low couch, which she had been using increasingly as the weeks had compressed their work hours, and didn't sleep. She tracked the sounds of the house, the distant movements of the night staff, the settling of the structure in the cold, the particular quality of silence that meant nothing was happening yet. At 6, she got up and washed her face and read through the full documentation they had assembled, all of it, again, looking for anything she had missed. At 7:30, Mira knocked on the study door. Selene knew from the knock. She knew before Mira opened the door. She had always been too good at reading what sounds meant. "He was taken," Mira said. No preamble. In 8 weeks, Selene had learned to be grateful for the specific absence of softening in how Mira delivered things. 2 hours ago, inside Lord Arden's townhouse, the household guard was waiting. The room was very still. "The complaint," Selene said. "The separation order was issued last night, moved up. Pell had a council quorum meeting at 10 in the evening, an emergency session. The order was approved before the Duke reached the townhouse." Mira's voice was steady. Her hands were not, quite. They were waiting for him specifically. Selene sat with that. Her uncle had anticipated the move. He had gotten the separation order approved early, which gave the guard legal standing to apprehend Ravenhart at a location that made him look like a thief, which made everything she had said at the gala look like the cover story of a conspiracy that was exactly what Pell had claimed it was. He had not come back through the front door. He had come back through the mechanism, with perfect timing, and he had used the 4-day window she thought they had and turned it into a trap on the second day. She had underestimated him. Again. Still. The shape of her own failure was very clear to her in this moment. She had understood that he was dangerous. She had understood that he anticipated her. She had not fully understood that he had been anticipating her specifically. Not Ravenhart, not the conspiracy, but her, Selene, the piece that had turned, which meant he had already constructed a response to her turning and was running it now, and had been running it since the gala. "Where is he being held?" she said. "The council's formal detention facility, north wing of the palace complex." Mira paused. "There will be a hearing, today, emergency session." "Today," Selene said. "The complaint has been upgraded. The perjury charge against you stands. The charge against the Duke has been amended to include unlawful entry, conspiracy against the crown, and—" Mira stopped. "Say it." "Treason," Mira said. Selene stood up. The treason charge carried a specific set of legal consequences in this kingdom that she understood with perfect clarity, because she had spent 8 weeks reading every document available to her, and some that were not technically available, and the consequences were not abstract. They were procedurally defined. They were, under the council's formal mechanism, not subject to the king's direct commutation without the council's agreement, which Pell had and would maintain. She had 4 hours before the hearing. She made herself breathe with full deliberateness. In, the full capacity of her lungs; out, completely. Because the alternative was the narrowing of thought that came with panic, and she did not have the luxury of narrowed thought right now. She thought of every resource she currently controlled. She thought of every relationship she had built in 8 weeks of careful social work. She thought of the documentation in the study, what was complete and what wasn't, what could be presented at an emergency hearing with the time available and what couldn't. Then she thought of Marath. Ravenhart had said he needed Marath. She had said Marath was owned by her uncle's threat. Remove the threat. Remove the obligation. The documentation Ravenhart had gone to retrieve was now inaccessible, probably moved, certainly compromised. But there was something else she had been carrying for 3 weeks without fully using it. Something she had noted and filed and not yet spent, because the timing had never been exactly right. The Marath information she had found wasn't just the shipping documentation her uncle held over him. There was a second set of records, buried in the Eastern Guild filings she had worked through in the 3rd week, a clean set with no irregularities. Documentation of a period before the Guild's corruption had fully taken hold, when Marath's family business had operated legitimately, which meant there was a version of Marath's record that predated the compromised version and could, in the right framing, give him something the blackmail had removed from him entirely. A way out that wasn't through her uncle. She looked at Mira. I need a carriage. Now. I need to be at Lord Marath's residence within the hour. Mira looked at her steadily. You understand that if you're seen moving around the city today, the perjury complaint will proceed whether I'm seen or not, Selene said. The complaint is going forward regardless. I need to move before the hearing, not after it. She was already moving toward the door. Get the carriage? Marath answered his own door, which told her he had dismissed his morning staff, which told her he had been expecting something and didn't want witnesses to his reaction to it. He was a heavier man than he appeared at court events. The formality of those settings arranged him differently than he was in a silk morning coat with no public performance required. He looked at Selene in his doorway with the expression of someone confronting a problem they had hoped wouldn't arrive quite this specifically. Duchess, he said. I need 10 minutes, she said. Your husband was arrested this morning. You understand that anything you say to me, I know what was arrested this morning, and I know why, and I know who arranged it, she said. I also know what Selene Arden has been holding over you for 14 months, and I know something he doesn't know I know. She held his gaze. 10 minutes. He stepped back from the door. She did not waste the 10 minutes. She sat across from him in a receiving room that smelled of old wood and stale anxiety, and she put the guild documentation in front of him. She had taken it from the study on her way out, the relevant pages, and she explained with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this in her head during the carriage ride, exactly what it showed and what it meant and what he could do with it. This predates the irregularities, she said. This is your family's record before any of it. It's clean, it's complete. It's documented by the guild's own archivists. She watched his face. Whatever he's holding over you, this is the counter. Not a refutation of the bad record, but evidence of a prior legitimate operation that establishes context and intent. Presented correctly, it doesn't clear everything, but it changes the nature of the charge. It gives you a defense he doesn't control. Marath was looking at the documents. And what you want in return, he said. Testimony at today's hearing, she said. Testimony about what you know of the network, what you signed and under what circumstances. The coercion, all of it. She paused. I know what I'm asking. I know the risk of it. I'm not pretending it's a small thing. He was quiet for a long time. He'll come back at me, Marath said. Yes, she said. He will try. But if today's hearing goes the way it can go with your testimony, the mechanism he's been using is gone. Pell's counsel's standing depends on this complaint succeeding. If it fails, the emergency session authority collapses. He loses the tool. If the hearing goes the way it can go, Marath said, that's a large conditional. Yes, she said. It is. He looked at the documents for another long moment. She let him look. She had learned in 8 weeks of building things that some silences were not worth filling. I'll be at the hearing, he said. She arrived at the palace's north wing with 40 minutes to spare. The council chamber used for formal hearings was a room she had never entered before, smaller than she had imagined, with a specific intimacy that was worse than a large space would have been, the kind of room where everything said reached everyone present without any acoustic mercy. 7 council members at the formal bench, Pell at the center. 2 members she didn't recognize, 2 she recognized from the documentation. And at the far end of the chamber's seating, with a quality of contained stillness she recognized from across any room, Ravenhart. He had been brought from the detention facility dressed in what he had been wearing when he was taken, not the formal presentation of a man appearing before a council, but the operational clothing of a man caught in the middle of something. It was, she understood, deliberate. The visual argument was already being made before a word was said. He saw her come in. Something moved across his face. She had become, over 8 weeks, fluent enough in the specific language of his expression to read it. Not relief exactly. Something more tightly wound than relief. More complicated. The face of a man who had spent the night in a detention cell running calculations about her safety and had arrived at conclusions he hadn't liked. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked away because she needed to look at the room, and she needed to look at it before the room started. Pell called the session to order. The formal charges were read. The language was clean and devastating and had been crafted by someone who understood exactly how to make a guilty sentence feel inevitable before the evidence was assessed. Ravenhart sat through it with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and his face at the absolute blank she recognized as everything locked down, everything below the surface and nothing above it. Pell called his first witness. One of the council members presenting the documentation of the separation order timeline, the legal authority under which the detention had been executed. Clean procedure, all of it correct. Selene sat in the chamber seating with her back straight and her hands in her lap and waited for the moment. Then the door opened. Marath. Pell turned. The expression on his face moved through something complex in approximately half a second. Surprise, calculation, recovery, and landed on a performance of composure that was slightly too controlled to be genuine. Lord Marath is not scheduled. Lord Marath requests permission to address the council, Marath said, in the voice of a man who had made a decision and was moving through it rather than around it. As a witness with direct knowledge of the conspiracy under examination. The chamber went very quiet. Selene looked at Ravenhart. He was looking at Marath. Then he looked at her. The question in his expression was absolute and direct. How, it asked, and when, and at what cost. And she held his gaze without answering because there wasn't time to answer it, and the answer wasn't the point. The point was what happened next. Pell was speaking, controlled, procedural, the language of a man trying to manage a situation using rules as tools. But she could hear beneath the controlled language the first frequency of something else, something that had not been in his voice at the gala or in the formal complaint documents. The frequency of a man realizing that the architecture he had built was under pressure. It had not been designed to withstand. She was watching his hands. They were absolutely still on the bench before him. That stillness was not composure. She had learned enough about this kind of stillness, in 8 weeks of watching a man who made it look effortless, to know the difference. Pell was afraid. And in the moment she recognized it, she saw her uncle across the chamber. He had entered behind Marath. She hadn't seen it. She should have seen it. And he was not looking at Pell or at Marath or at Ravenhart. He was looking at her. His face had the expression she had been waiting to see for weeks. Not the pleasant surface, not the anticipating confirmation, not even the cold, stripped-back reality she had seen at the gala. This was something older than all of those things, something personal and precise and entirely without the cover of strategy. He was looking at her the way a man looks at someone who has destroyed something he spent years building. Not with hatred exactly, with the specific expression of loss that is so large it has moved past feeling and arrived at a kind of white, focused silence. She looked back at him. She did not look away. Marath was speaking now. The chamber was listening with the quality of attention that only assembled in a room when something genuinely unexpected was happening. Not just procedurally surprising, but foundationally disruptive. The kind of testimony that didn't just change the current proceeding, but retroactively changed the shape of everything that had preceded it. He was naming names. He was describing coercions. He was doing it with the flat, specific courage of a man who had decided that the risk of speaking was less than the cost of continuing to be owned. Ravenhart's hands had not moved from the table, but his eyes had found hers across the chamber, and what was in them was not the contained calculation she had catalogued in the first days of knowing him, and it was not the quality of being seen that had frightened her because it was so total, and it was not the brief opening she had witnessed in the study at 6 a.m. when he had said something unguarded and immediately closed the door on it. It was something that had no defensive architecture around it at all. She had exactly enough time to recognize it before Pell's voice cut through the chamber with the sudden sharpness of a man abandoning procedural management for something more direct. "This testimony is inadmissible," Pell said. "Lord Marath standing before this council is compromised by his own documented irregularities, which are exactly what I am here to testify about," Marath said, with the specific calm of someone who had already paid the entry cost and was past the point where escalation changed the calculation. "The irregularities document Marath's guilt, not his credibility. They document what Lord Arden held over me and how long he held it," Marath said, louder now, the calm acquiring an edge. "They document a coercion that goes back 14 months and connects directly to the information network this council has been using as the basis for tonight's charges." The chamber was breaking open. She could feel it. The controlled procedural environment that Pell had constructed with such care cracking along the lines of pressure that had been building since the gala. Since Marath walked through the door, since Ravenhart had been brought in wearing operational clothes as a visual argument, and the argument had started working against the people who made it the moment a credible witness stood up and told the room what the visual was covering. And then her uncle moved. Not toward her, not toward the bench. He moved toward the chamber's side door. The quiet, specific movement of a man who had decided that the situation was no longer recoverable and was extracting himself with the same instinct he had used at the gala. The instinct that had kept him operational for 11 years of building a conspiracy inside a court full of people who should have seen him. She stood up. "Stop him," she said. The room's attention swung to her. Pell was already speaking over her. One of the council members was on his feet. The chamber's procedural fabric was tearing in 4 directions simultaneously, and in the middle of all of it, Ravenhart was standing, both hands flat on the table, pushing himself upright with the specific deliberateness of a man who has been still for a long time and has decided with absolute finality that stillness is over. His voice cut through everything. "Arden," one word. The specific register of a man who has spent 11 years learning exactly how much volume a single name requires to stop a room. It stopped the room. Fen Arden stopped at the side door. His hand was on the frame. He did not turn around immediately. She could see the calculation happening in his back, in the set of his shoulders, the half-second of a man deciding whether running was still viable. He turned. The expression on his face when he looked at Ravenhart was the expression of a man who had built a monster in his imagination for 11 years and was confronting, for the first time, the specific quality of what the monster looked like when it had nothing left to manage and nothing left to lose. "The documentation in your study," Ravenhart said. His voice was completely level. It was the most frightening thing about him. Not the anger which was visible now in every line of his body, but the fact that his voice remained level anyway. "The false bottom 3rd drawer. My wife described it accurately. We both know what's in it." He looked at Arden across the chamber with the specific, absolute attention he gave to everything he had decided was finished. "You have 2 choices. You walk back to that bench and you tell this council everything. Or I walk out of this room and I get what's in that drawer myself, tonight. And everything that follows from that is your decision, not mine." The chamber held its breath. Selene looked at her uncle. He was looking at Ravenhart. His face was doing something she had never seen it do in all the years she had known him. Working through something it couldn't process fast enough. The machinery of a calculating mind hitting a variable it hadn't accounted for, which was a man who had decided that the cost of losing everything was less than the cost of protecting what had already been spent. The side door was a foot from his hand. He had not moved through it. She understood watching him that the decision he was making right now was going to determine everything. Not just the hearing, not just the charges, not just the specific shape of the next 12 hours, but the entire remaining architecture of what she had understood her life to be. There was a version of the next 30 seconds where her uncle walked through that door and the chamber fractured completely, and Ravenhart moved on his threat, and everything descended into a fight with no procedural cover and no guaranteed outcome. And there was another version. His hand dropped from the doorframe. He turned toward the bench. Selene felt the breath come back into her body. She hadn't known she was holding it. Ravenhart was still standing. He had not taken his eyes off Arden. And in his face, in the specific quality of the stillness that had returned after the one moment of absolute exposure, she could see the things she had identified weeks ago in the study. Not triumph, not the satisfaction of a battle going right, but the face of a man who had been fighting alone for so long that having someone in the room who knew all of it and was still standing there had become, quietly and without announcement, the thing that made the fighting possible. Pell said something. She didn't hear it. She was watching her uncle walk toward the council bench with the gait of a man who had spent his entire life moving the world and had discovered, at 60 years old, in a room full of witnesses, that the world had been moving him instead. And then from the corner of her eye, she saw one of Pell's council allies rise from the bench. Not procedurally, not formally, but with the specific sudden movement of a man acting before he could stop himself, his hand going to the formal guard at the chamber door, a word exchanged too quickly and too quietly, and the guard's hand moving in response. Not toward Arden, toward Ravenhart. The guard's hand had not yet closed on Ravenhart's arm when Selene moved. She crossed the chamber floor in the specific silence that follows a decision too fast for thought. Not brave, not calculated, just the body moving ahead of everything slower than itself. She put herself between the guard and her husband with the flatness of someone placing an object in a doorway, and she looked at the council member who had given the order with the kind of directness that had nowhere left to be polite. "Touch him," she said, "and every name in that documentation goes to the king before this session closes. Not the council, the king, directly." The council member had the look of a man who had issued an order and was watching it complicate in real time. He was perhaps 55, with the careful grooming of someone who had spent decades in proximity to power and understood that appearance was a form of argument. He looked at Selene and then at Ravenhart and then at Pell, which told her what she needed to know about where the authority in the room actually lived. Pell said nothing. That was its own answer. The guard stepped back. Selene did not move from where she was standing for another 3 full seconds, long enough that it was not a flinch, not a repositioning, but a choice to stay and then a choice to move. And then she turned back to the bench and said, in the voice she had been building since the first morning in the study, "Lord Marath has requested permission to complete his testimony. I suggest the council allow it." The chamber reassembled itself around a new center of gravity. She could feel it happen. Not dramatically, not with any single definitive moment, but the way a room shifts when the people in it collectively update their understanding of who is managing the situation and who is being managed. Pell was still at the center of the bench. The formal authority was still his. But authority and power were not the same thing, and the room now knew the difference. Marath testified for 40 minutes. He was not eloquent. He was not performing. He spoke with the specific flat texture of a man getting through something by refusing to make it larger than it was. Names, dates, the specific sequence of coercions, the documentation he had signed and under what circumstances, the information he had channeled, and to whom. He spoke about Fen Arden with the quality of someone describing a mechanism rather than a person, which was, Selene thought, probably the only way he could get through it. He spoke about Ravenhart with something different, not warmth, not alliance, but the specific accuracy of a man correcting a record he had contributed to dirtying, which was its own kind of cost, and he paid it without looking away from the bench. Fen Arden sat through all of it. He sat with his hands folded and his expression at the blank that Selene recognized as his version of what Ravenhart's total stillness was. Not composure, but the appearance of it, maintained through the force of a lifelong habit of performing whatever the moment required. She watched him while Marath spoke, and she looked for the thing she had been looking for since she was old enough to understand she was looking for it. The moment when his face told the truth about what was inside it, the unmanaged second, the genuine. She found it once. When Marath described the specific mechanism by which Arden had arranged her marriage, not the financial terms, not the alliance language, but the actual strategic reasoning behind the selection of Selene specifically, her particular access, her particular training, the particular way she had been prepared since childhood for exactly the kind of social navigation that would make her useful in a duke's household. Arden's face did something brief and total that was not guilt and was not shame, but was something adjacent to both of them, something that had the quality of a man confronting the full weight of a thing he had managed to keep at arm's length until this moment. He looked old. She had never thought of him as old before. He had always been the figure of the room, the organizing intelligence around which everything arranged itself. Looking at him now, in a council chamber with Marath's testimony in the air and 11 years of careful construction coming apart around him, he looked like what he actually was. A man in his 60s who had spent his best decades building something that had just been dismantled in 40 minutes by the people he had most underestimated. She did not feel satisfaction. She had expected to feel something closer to satisfaction, and what she felt instead was quieter and more complicated. The specific exhaustion of a wound that has finally been cleaned, which is not the same as healed, and does not feel like relief exactly, but which is at least the right kind of pain. The hearing ended in the late afternoon. The formal outcome was procedural and would take weeks to complete in all its legal specificity. Charges withdrawn, investigation transferred to a different council body with different composition. The specific question of Arden's liability referred upward for the king's direct consideration. None of it was finished. None of it would be finished quickly. But the immediate charges against Ravenhart were suspended pending the new investigation, and the separation order was vacated, and Pell left the chamber without speaking to anyone, and with the contained movement of a man who understood that today's loss was going to require a very long and very careful recovery. Ravenhart walked out of the council chamber into the palace corridor and stopped. Selene came through the door behind him and stopped beside him. They stood in the corridor in the specific silence of two people who have been moving at speed for so long that the absence of motion feels structurally wrong, like a sound that has been present for months suddenly gone. He turned and looked at her. She had gotten very good at reading him. She was not sure in this moment that she was reading him correctly because what was in his face was something she had only seen once before. Briefly, in the study at 6 a.m, for approximately 3 seconds before the door closed on it. It was there now, without the door. Wide open, and apparently without any immediate intention of closing. The drawer, he said. His voice was different than it had been in the chamber. Lower. The public register stripped away. You described it to me from memory. Yes. You were 12 years old when you noticed it. I noticed a lot of things at 12. She held his gaze. I didn't know what most of them meant yet. He was quiet for a moment. When did you start knowing what they meant? Somewhere around the night you said his name in the study. She breathed. Everything before that was just observation. After that, it had a shape. The corridor was empty around them. Somewhere deeper in the palace complex, she could hear the procedural noise of the session's aftermath, voices, movement, the institutional machinery continuing to run. Out here, it was just the two of them, and the cold stone and the gray afternoon light coming through the high windows. You put yourself in front of the guard, he said. Yes. That was... He stopped. She watched him work through whatever he was trying to say, which was unusual enough that she gave it the full space it needed. That was not a thing you needed to do. I know, she said. I could have... You were unarmed in a formal hearing, and the guard had a weapon, and 3 council members were in the room, she said. What you could have done would have ended this differently, and you know it. His jaw shifted. He looked at the corridor floor for a moment and then back at her. Yes, he said. I know it. She understood, in the quality of that admission, the same quality as the night he had said he could have told her about the social isolation. Yes, that this was what accountability looked like in him. Not elaborate, not performed, just the direct acknowledgement of the accurate thing, which cost him something and which he paid anyway. Marath, he said, I went to him this morning. The guild documentation, the clean records from before the irregularities. I had them from the 3rd week. I hadn't spent them yet. You held them. I didn't know what they were for yet. She paused. I do now. He looked at her for a long time. In the 8 weeks she had known him, she had accumulated a significant internal library of the ways he looked at things, cataloged by what they meant and what they cost him to show. This look was not in the library. It was new, or it was old and previously hidden, and it had the specific quality of something that had stopped being managed and was simply present, unguarded in the way that only things are unguarded when a person has used up the last of their capacity for performance, and what remains is just what's actually there. "Why?" he said. Came out quiet, almost without the usual architecture of a question, not demanding, not analytical. The plainest possible form of the word. She understood what he was asking, not why she had gone to Marath, not why she had held the documents, not any of the specific strategic questions. The larger why. The one that had been accumulating since the first morning she knocked on a study door at 6 because she heard a man pressing against something that was pressing back. "Because you told me the truth," she said, "in the study, that first night. You didn't have to tell me the truth. You could have given me the same version you give everyone else." She looked at him steadily. "You didn't." He was very still. "And because you were right," she said, "about what you needed. Something in this house that wasn't calculating the best way to use you." She let that sit. "I'm not that. I never was. Not for you." The silence that followed was the longest they had sat together and the most complete. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say, but the silence of two people who have said the important thing and are still in the same place, which is different, which is rarer. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not as a gesture designed to be read by a room, just the specific human fact of one person's hand finding another's, with the quality of something that had been a long time coming and was arriving, finally, without ceremony. She held it. The weeks that followed had the particular texture of aftermath, not peaceful, not clean, but the honest version of things that have come through destruction and are being rebuilt from what remained. The formal investigation into Arden's network ran through the winter with the grinding patience of institutional process. Names were named, documents were examined. The specific architecture of 11 years of corruption inside the royal court was mapped with the care it deserved, which was the care of something large and serious being taken apart correctly so it couldn't be reassembled. Pell resigned his council position in the second week, citing health, which was the language the court used for outcomes of this kind. 3 other council members followed in the month after. The Eastern Shipping Guild underwent a formal review that produced results no one who had been paying attention found surprising. Crestwell was the last to fall, and he fell the most completely, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the slow collapse of every relationship he had maintained through the conspiracy's infrastructure, which, once the infrastructure was gone, turned out to be most of them. By the time the formal findings reached him, he had already become something the court no longer needed to fear or court, or even particularly notice. Ravenhart managed all of it with the quality she had identified from the beginning: precise, patient, operating several steps ahead of the people who thought they were matching him. But there was something different in how he moved through it now. Not softer exactly, more complete. The specific difference between a man fighting to protect something that might be taken and a man fighting because the protection itself had become the thing worth doing. She watched it and filed it in the same place she filed everything that mattered, which was no longer the cold storage of survival necessity, but something warmer and less defended. Marath became an unlikely and wholly unsentimental ally. Not warm, never warm, but present in the specific way of a man who had made a decision he was going to live with and had decided to live with it well. He appeared at 2 critical points in the investigation with documentation that filled gaps Selene hadn't known were there, and he never mentioned the guild records she had brought him, and she never mentioned them either, and between them this became its own form of understanding. Her uncle was the hardest. Not because the legal outcome was complicated, it wasn't, once the full shape of the conspiracy was documented. His land holdings were reviewed, his council connections severed, his financial interests brought under formal scrutiny that would take years to resolve completely. He would not recover from this. She knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them was operating under any other assumption. The hardest part was something smaller than the legal machinery. It was a letter. He sent it in the 3rd week, through formal channels, addressed to her at Blackthorn Manor, where she and Ravenhart had returned once the immediate proceedings allowed it. 3 pages in his handwriting, which she had known since childhood as the handwriting of a man who thought everything through twice before committing it to the page. She opened it alone, in the library, in the afternoon light that came through the same windows she had been reading in since the first week of her marriage. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. What he said instead was something she had not anticipated. A description, flat and oddly precise, of the specific calculation he had made when he selected her for the placement. The reasoning, the logic, the way he had understood her capabilities and had looked at them and seen tools rather than a person, and had never, in the entire architecture of the plan, asked what she wanted or considered that the question was relevant. He said, at the end of the 3 pages, that he understood now that it had been relevant. That was all. She sat with those 3 pages for a long time. She thought about what it cost a man like Arden to write them. Not much, perhaps, in absolute terms, but something, and she could feel the something in the careful flatness of the language. He had spent his life managing his relationship to truth the way other men managed money, only spending it when the return justified the cost. These 3 pages were a kind of spending. She didn't write back. Not then. She wasn't ready, and she was done doing things before she was ready. She put the letter in the library's writing desk, not the cold storage, not the survival archive, just a drawer, just a piece of paper, belonging to someone she had loved before she understood what he was, which was a complicated truth that did not require resolution in order to be carried. The first genuine winter came to Blackthorn Manor in the way first winters come, not announced but suddenly present, the gardens going quiet and white overnight with the specific totality of a season that doesn't negotiate. Selene was in the library when she heard Ravenhart come in from the north corridor. She did not look up from the document she was reading, which was not a political document. She had been reading less of those recently, deliberately, as a form of practice in existing without the constant forward lean of threat management. It was a history, the second shelf of the eastern wall. He came and stood near the window and looked out at the gardens. She had catalogued over months the specific qualities of his silences. This one was the evening variety, not working, not managing, not the compressed stillness of a man running calculations. Just a person at the end of a day, standing near a window, present in the specific way that people are present when they have stopped performing being somewhere and are simply there. The investigation closes next week, he said. I know. The king's formal commendation is ceremonial. It doesn't change anything material. I know that too. She turned a page. You don't want it. I don't particularly need it. That's not the same thing. A pause. She heard him turn slightly from the window. No, he said. It's not. She set down the book and looked at him. He was in profile against the window's gray-white light, the snow-covered gardens behind him, and the quality of him in this moment was one she had not seen before she knew him and would not have believed if someone had described it. Not relaxed exactly, because that was not a state she thought he accessed, but something adjacent to it, something that had the texture of a man who had set a very heavy thing down and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. She had thought in the early weeks that the fortress he had built around himself was the real thing, that the architecture of control and distance and precise management was what he actually was, and whatever existed beneath it was vestigial, surviving rather than living. She understood now that she had been looking at it backwards. The fortress was the cost. What was inside it was the real thing. What was inside it had been real the whole time, surviving in the specific stubborn way that real things survive. Not triumphantly, not cleanly, but persistently, refusing to be entirely extinguished no matter how much pressure was applied from outside or how efficiently the man himself tried to extinguish it from within. Can I ask you something? She said. He turned fully from the window and looked at her. You do regardless, he said, which was the same thing he had said the first morning in the study. And the fact that he said it with something different in it now, something that had warmth in it, genuinely, without any performance of warmth, was one of those things she put in the non-archive place. What did you think, she said, the first morning, when you opened the study door? He considered this with the full seriousness he gave everything he considered. I thought you were going to be a problem. In what sense? In the sense that you knocked on a door at 6 in the morning in a house where no one had knocked on that door in 11 years, he said, and you weren't frightened, and you said something accurate about what you had heard, and you stood there and waited for me to decide what to do about it. A pause. In the sense that you were clearly not what I had been given. What had you been given? The description your uncle provided, he said. A manageable girl from a good family with the right connections and no significant opinions. She laughed. It came out genuine and brief and slightly surprised, the way real laughter comes when something lands in the exact right place. He watched her laugh with the expression she had stopped trying to catalog because it exceeded her system. It was too specific, too much his, too much the particular face of a man who had not had enough of that sound in his house and was in the process of understanding what its absence had cost him. He was wrong about all of it, she said. Yes, he said. He was. She looked at him across the library, across the space that had been accumulating their shared history for months, the document stacks, the working hours, the arguments with sharp edges, the silences that had changed their quality from tactical to something else entirely. She thought about what it meant to know a person, not to understand them as a set of characteristics or a strategic object or a problem to be managed, but to know them in the specific sense of having been present while they were real. It was not a thing she had expected to find in this house. She had come here planning to survive. She had not planned for this. But the things that mattered had a way of arriving without being planned for. She had noticed that early and filed it and only understood what she was filing much later. Caedric, she said. She had used his name perhaps 4 times in all the months she had known him. Each time it cost something small and precise, not difficult, but deliberate, the way you use a specific tool for a specific purpose. He heard the deliberateness in it. She could see him hear it. "I'm not leaving," she said. Not as reassurance, not as a comfort, as a statement of the same quality as the statements they had always made to each other. Unornamented, meaning exactly what it said, offered without demand that it be received in any particular way. "I want you to know that. Whatever the investigation produces, whatever comes next, I'm not leaving." He crossed the library. Not quickly. With the specific unhurried quality of a man who has decided something and is moving through the decision rather than rushing it. He stopped in front of her chair and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the space between them had the weight of everything they had built and survived and refused to collapse under. He said quietly, "I know." And then, "I'm not leaving either." She reached up and took his hand, the same gesture as the corridor outside the council chamber, the same specific human fact of it. And he held on, and outside the library windows the snow continued to fall over the blackthorn gardens with the patient persistence of winter doing what winter does, covering the evidence of what had grown and what had been cut back and what had survived underground, waiting for a different season. Months later, when the kingdom had settled into its new shape and the court had completed its long process of deciding what the story of the year was and who the figures in it had been, there was a particular evening that Selene remembered the way she remembered very few things, not as a set of details catalogued for use, but as a whole, undivided, belonging entirely to itself. They were in the garden. Late. The winter had broken into the tentative early warmth of a season turning, and the snow was gone from the garden paths, and the bare branches had begun to show the first evidence of what was coming. She had come out for air and found him already there, standing at the garden's far end, where the old stone wall held the last of the day's warmth, looking at nothing specific with the quality of a man genuinely at rest. She stood beside him. The silence was the evening kind. Around them the garden held its changing self. Not yet what it would be, no longer what it had been, moving through the specific honest state of something in the process of becoming. "The court has decided you're a hero," she said. "I know," he said. "I find it about as convincing as the previous characterization." Which was a monster. He looked sideways at her. "Neither one is particularly accurate." "No," she said. "Neither one is." She thought about what was accurate. A man who had learned to make himself into a fortress because the alternative had cost him things he couldn't afford to lose again. A man whose intelligence was so complete that it had outrun his ability to use it warmly until someone had stood in a doorway at 6 in the morning and declined to be afraid of it. A man who had been wrong, more than once, and had acknowledged it every time, which was the specific quality she had decided was the truest measure of a person. Not whether they were wrong, but what they did when they were. He was looking at this garden. "I spent 11 years making sure nothing I cared about could be used against me," he said. "The most effective way to do that was to not care about anything." "I know," she said. "It turns out that's not actually available as a long-term strategy." He said it with the dry flatness she had come to love, the specific humor of a man who had arrived at truths the hard way and had the grace to find them instructive. Something I should probably have understood earlier. You understood it when you needed to, she said. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. She looked at him. There's a difference. He looked back at her. In the last of the evening light, in the garden that had come through a hard season and was now showing the first evidence of what it intended to be next, his face had the quality she had come to think of as his real face. Not the public architecture, not the fortress, but the man inside it, who was more complicated and more human, and considerably more worth knowing than any version of the stories about him had ever managed to contain. The whole kingdom was afraid of me, he said. It was not a boast. It was a quiet accounting, a man looking at something he had built and understanding it honestly, the costs alongside the utility. She thought about the girl who had walked down a cathedral aisle at 18 and looked directly into the eyes of the man everyone was afraid to look at, and had not looked away. She thought about what she had understood in that moment, which she hadn't had language for then, and which she had spent months building the language for since. I know, she said. I wasn't. No, he said. You weren't. The garden held its quiet around them. Somewhere in the manor behind them, a door opened and closed, the ordinary sound of a house continuing its life. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky above the stone wall, cold and specific, indifferent to everything below them in the particular way that distant things are indifferent, which had always seemed to her not like cruelty but like permission. Permission to be small and serious and present in your own specific life without requiring the universe to take note. I was afraid, he said, very quietly, as though the honesty of it required low volume to be fully accurate. She understood he didn't mean the kingdom. He didn't mean Pell or Arden or the conspiracy or any of the external machinery they had fought their way through. Of this, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. So was I. He nodded, slowly, with the quality of a man receiving something he had been waiting to hear without knowing he was waiting. Then he looked back at the garden, at the dark soil showing through where the snow had been, at the branches beginning their slow, committed work of becoming something new. And she stood beside him, and the evening settled around them with the unhurried patience of things that have finally arrived where they were always going. It was not triumphant. It was not the clean ending that stories promised when she was young enough to believe stories promised anything. It was the thing that came after the fortress, the specific, undefended, entirely real quality of two people who had come through something hard and had arrived on the other side of it, still standing and still together and willing, for the first time, to call that enough. More than enough. It was everything.